In this video, we're going to cover some additional poker terminology, poker notation, and poker acronyms that's going to be important for you to know as you progress through this course, as well as you progress through your poker learning experience. So just to forewarn you, this is going to be a quite lengthy video. We have 12 different slides to cover, and we're covering all the topics that you see here listed on this slide. So I'm not going to list all of them off. Let's just go ahead and let's get into them, and let's talk about the first one. So the first thing that I want to talk about is referring to we. So as I progress through this course and as I talk about different concepts, as I go through different hand examples, as I'm playing with live play videos, or I'm doing hand history reviews, or I'm doing a league finder review for a student, I'm typically going to refer as to we rather than you or I. And for me, I do this because I look at this from the perspective as us walking through this content together. We're working through this content and this course together. So with me as your poker coach or your poker teacher, whatever you want to call me, I'm guiding you through all this, and we're going through this together. So I'd rather refer to you and I together as we, as poker players against our opponents, rather than saying you or I. Now, I may say you or I, but I'm going to try to stick to the concept of referring to we. Now, in addition to that, I'll also refer to the concept of hero versus villain. And so instead of saying you or I or we, I may actually call us hero. So if let's say, for example, that you submit a hand for me to take a look at in the course Q&A, or you have a league finder video, or one of my students has submitted one, or I'm doing a hand history review, I may refer to us as hero. And you're going to see this a lot in poker videos, poker training content, hand history reviews from other coaches. There's typically going to be the villain, our opponent or opponents, and there's going to be hero, ourselves, the poker player. And so when you hear the term hero or villain, don't get confused. When we're saying hero, we're talking about you or I, or both of us together walking through this content. And villain can be one specific opponent in a heads-up situation, or in a multi-pot situation where, let's say, we have 3 different opponents. They're all going to be our villains. They're all going to be our opponents. So when you hear this term, I just want you to understand what we're referring to in regards to hero or villain. All right, so now let's jump to some basic table positions and acronyms. I know I covered this earlier in the course with the Poker 101 video if you watched that, but if you didn't, then this is going to be important because I want to talk about these positions. Most of you probably know what these are, but I want to make sure that I cover them quickly, and I also cover their associated acronym. So in a 6-max game, and this course is really geared towards 6-max players, we're not going to be playing full ring table. We're going to be focusing on 6-max because it really is the most popular type of game online right now for cash games. So there are 6 different positions. We have the dealer button, and we have the person that sits there. So remember, this moves clockwise every hand. If remember, you watched this hopefully in the Poker 101 video. Whenever you see this at the table, whether it be online or whether you're at a casino or a home game, that denotes that you are on the button. So if you're playing a home game, for example, the person that is on the button, on the dealer button, that's the person that's going to be dealing the cards. Then directly to the left of that person, and when I say left, we're facing inward, so this is going to be left. It's going to be clockwise. We have the small blind, denoted by SB. We have the big blind, denoted by uppercase BB, and then we'll talk about the difference in regards to the actual bet sizing and denominations in BB. We'll talk about that later in this lecture. And then we have under the gun, denoted by UTG. Then we have middle position, denoted by MP. And some people may call this a different acronym. Just don't worry. I call it middle position. You may see people call it something else. All in all, it's just the same position. It's 2 positions over from the big blind. Then after middle position, we have the cutoff, denoted by CO. And then lastly, of course, the dealer or the button, denoted by BTN. So you may hear me say the actual name, or you may hear me say UTG, MP, CO, BTN, SB, BB, in these different lectures when I'm writing out some sort of an example. So I just want to make sure that I cover that. All right, So the next important thing that I want you to understand is a suited versus a off-suited hand notation. So of course, with any hand, let's take ace king for example, there's going to be a suited version of it, such as ace king of hearts. And then there's going to be an off-suited version where maybe the ace is the diamond and the king is of the hearts. And so when I'm talking about suited versus off-suited, or I'm doing some sort of analysis, or I'm referring to you, if for some reason after the hand, if there's an S or there's an O, that's where you're going to know that there's a difference. So ace king S means ace king suited. Ace king O means ace king off suited. So I just want to make sure you understand that as well before we go any further. So ace king of clubs, ace king of diamonds, ace king of hearts, and so forth. And then ace king off suit is going to be any ace king hand where it's two different suits, such as ace king of diamonds, ace of diamonds and king of hearts. Okay, so that is suited versus off suited notation. The next thing, which is very important, is understanding what a hand range is and what hand range notation is. So when we talk about our opponents, we talk about the different hands that they play. We typically assign them a range of hands. We don't assign them one single hand. And I'm going to talk about this a bit further in a different video where we're going to talk about thinking about hands and ranges. I want to make sure that I talk about this a bit more in depth. But I do want to talk about this now, and you're going to hear me talk about this all throughout the course. So hand ranges, it's important to understand that our opponents don't do anything with one particular hand. They're going to do it with a set range of hands, multiple different hands. And so that's what we need to think about when we're playing poker. This could be something that they are open limping with. This could be something that they're over limping with. This could be something that they're raising pre-flop with or raising post-flop with. Our opponents do it with a range of hands. So we need to understand that. And then when we're talking about ranges of hands, there's specific notation that we use. So you'll notice down here that I have specific notation. Let me get my highlighter ready. So any pocket pair is going to be denoted 2-2 plus, and 2-2 means pocket twos. And when you see this plus here, it means pocket twos all the way up to pocket aces, and we're actually going to see this on the next screen where I actually show all the different hands. Pocket jacks or better is going to be jack plus, of course. And then king queen suited and off suited or better is going to look something like this: king queen plus and ace jack plus. And then ace jack suited or better, you're going to notice that we have suited in here, so there's that S in there. And if I said ace jack off suited or better, then that would just be an O there. So let's actually take a look at every single hand. So we could do the plus, and the plus is a shorthand way of doing this, but if we wanted to actually show the entire range of hand in this notation, here's what it's going to look like. So pocket twos plus is going to be pocket twos all the way up to pocket aces. Pocket jacks plus is going to be pocket jacks, pocket queens, pocket kings, and pocket aces. And then king queen plus, ace jack plus is going to be this range here: king queen, ace jack, ace queen, and ace king. And you're going to notice this does not include pocket pairs. So when we write notation like this, we write it assuming that we're talking about hands that aren't pocket pairs. If there are pocket pairs within this range, we're going to include notations such as this as well. So if we wanted to include jacks, queens, kings, and aces, we would put another comma and we would say jack plus, including that. And you're going to notice that this doesn't talk about specifically suited or unsuited because we say suited and off-suited hands, so we don't have to put that notation in here either. And then we have ace jack suited or better. So we're talking about suited only. So there you go. We have the S in here where we're only talking about suited hands. And then if we're talking about, for example, we're doing range analysis on our opponent, we're talking about a specific villain, we could say something like this: villain's assumed hand range in this example is going to be pocket tens plus, king jack suited plus, and ace jack plus, which means suited and off suited. And this is what that range is going to look like. So that's hand ranges and hand range notation. And like I said, we're going to talk about range-based thinking and hand ranges all throughout this course. So I want to make sure that I introduced it here. All right, so the next thing that I want to talk about is something that I call the X notation. Again, another shorthand methodology to talk about any particular hand. So I may use the term X for a notation such as ace X or king X or queen X. So what does that mean? When I say ace X, I'm talking about any hand that includes an ace. When I'm talking about king X, I'm talking about any hand that includes a king. And when I'm talking about queen X, I'm talking about any hand that includes a queen. So again, this is just another shorthand methodology of talking about multiple different cards, a wide array of cards. And so any ace hand would be ace X, and that would be ace king down to ace 2. Now you could also denote this, you could say ace deuce plus. It would be the exact same thing, but this is again another way of doing this. And here's all the different hands that we're talking about. Ace king suited and offsuit, all the way down to ace deuce suited and offsuit. So again, another notation that I may talk about and you may hear on poker forums, in poker groups and so forth. Somebody may say ace X or king X or queen X or 10X or so forth. And remember, when we're talking about this, you're going to notice that in here we don't have pocket aces. So again, these are non-pocket pair hands. All right. So let's talk about some more shorthand notation. So again, in the world of poker, there's just all sorts of notation, and that's why we needed to put this lecture together. So when we're talking about the action in a hand, sometimes we're just going to say, our opponent limped, or our opponent called, or our opponent raised, but many times there may be multiple different actions, such as our opponent limped, and then we raised, and then they folded. So we're going to have multiple different actions, and I want to make sure that I talk about these as well. So limp fold, to limp and a fold to a raise. So again, we may denote this as limp fold, and typically what I do with this type of notation is I put this in the notes for my opponents. So while I'm playing, I like to take notes on my opponents, and I may do something like this. I may actually even make it more shorthand than this, but when I say limp fold, this is what it means. A limp call, to limp and then to call a raise. So for example, our opponent open limps, we raise it up, and then they call our raise. That would be a limp call. A limp raise, well, very similar, except rather than calling, they raise. So our opponent open limps, we raise, and then they re-raise us. So they're raising our bet. Check fold, this is going to be, let me actually highlight these, because these are pre-flop actions. And in regards to anything where there is a check, this is going to be post-flop. So if you're first to act, you can open fold, which I would never recommend doing. You could raise, in other words, bet. So if you're first to act post-flop, any bet from one big blind up to anything is going to be a bet. You can't raise, and I shouldn't have said that. And then you can check. So you can fold, check, or bet. So if our opponent is checking, and then they're facing a bet from their opponent, so let's say villain is checking their first act post-flop, and then it comes to us, hero. If we bet, then our opponent can take one of these other actions. They can fold to our bet, they can call our bet, or they can check, and then they can raise our bet, and we call this a check raise, and you probably have heard this a lot. So check fold, check call, or check raise. And then lastly, we have the bet. So again, if the person is first to act, they can either check, they can bet, or they can fold. So if they bet, then they can bet fold, they can bet call, or they can bet raise based upon what the opponent does. So our opponent bets, they face a raise from an opponent, and they fold to that raise. Our opponent bets, they face a raise, and then they call that raise. Our opponent bets, they face a raise, and they decide to re-raise. That would be a bet raise. So that's some additional shorthand notation for hand actions. All right, so now let's talk a bit more about range-based thinking. And actually, I thought that I put this in a different lecture, but it looks like I decided to put it in this lecture. So I guess we're going to cover all the basics here within this one lecture. So what you're going to notice before we talk about all these bullet points, because I have a lot of them in here, what you're going to notice here on the right, and let me just get my little pen tool. What you're going to notice here is that this is a screenshot from Equilab, something that I'll use from time to time in this course. And what you see here, and let me just highlight the whole thing in yellow, These are all of the possible hands that you can have, all the possible pre-flop starting hands in poker. And let me get rid of that because it's actually a bit easier to see. So what you're going to notice here on the left in kind of the light blue/gray, these are going to be the offsuited hands because you notice they're all denoted with the O. So one of the reasons why I wanted you to see that and understand that. And then over here on the top in this kind of light orange-ish color in the S, these are all the suited hands. And then in the center, we have all the pocket pairs in green. So pocket deuces all the way up to pocket aces. And what I've done is I just highlighted some hands arbitrarily. And what we can do with this tool is it highlights that actual range in that shorthand notation. Actually, it does it in the long form version of it. And what it does is this is a range of hands that our opponent could be doing something with. So let's say for just the ease of a simple example, let's say that this is a pre-flop betting range or pre-flop raising range for our opponent in the cutoff position. So again, our opponent in the cutoff position, they're not just going to be open raising a hand such as pocket aces or only pocket kings. They're going to be doing it with a range of hands. So we utilize this concept when we're trying to determine the possible hands that our opponent can have in a particular situation. Now let's try to narrow this down a bit. Let's say that we open raise under the gun to 3 big blinds, and the next person to act 3-bets us, and they're a really tight opponent. They're a nit. Well, what's the potential range of hands they could be doing that with? Well, right, they're not only going to be doing it with pocket aces, but maybe they're doing it with pocket kings and pocket queens, and let's say maybe ace king suited. So again, this would be their 3-betting range. So that's the whole point of this, is that our opponents are never going to be doing one specific action with only a specific hand. They're going to be taking that same action more often than not with more than one hand, with different hands. And our goal with range-based thinking is to try to, and I'm going to say this is my own term, guesstimate, because we're guessing, but we're estimating what type of range that they're on. And so why do we do this? Well, it's a more logical and effective way to thinking about what our opponents are doing at the table than saying, oh, he's only doing this ever with pocket aces. So if you've ever seen highlights from the WSOP with Daniel Negreanu, you'll think that he's a mind reader because he'll say specifically the hand that the opponent has. But what he's doing there realistically is he's doing a range-based analysis, and by the time they get to a specific river, he's narrowed that down to a subset of hands, and then he's just verbally trying to get a tell on his opponent by estimating by the time that they get to the river that their opponents, what's the most likely hand that they actually have. And we'll actually talk about that. I call that the funnel concept, so we'll talk about that throughout this course as well. So again, it's much easier and it's much more realistic to put our opponents on the spectrum of hands rather than one particular hand. It's just not very realistic. And we could do this from the concept of the funnel perspective. Let's say, okay, our opponent, villain, open raises under the gun. Well, it would be a lot more realistic to say, well, he's doing it with this range of hands versus saying, oh, he's open raising with pocket jacks here. And then on flop he bets, and then on the river he faces a check raise and he re-raises. Just saying that he's only has pocket jacks that entire time is not realistic. It's not effective, and it's not a logical way to think about what they're doing. We start with a range and we start to narrow it down. We say, okay, well, this is a range. Well, then on this flop texture, he's probably only going to be betting this particular subset of hands. And then when we get to the turn, he bets and faces a check raise. Well, then he's probably only doing it with this smaller range of hands based upon the strength of his hand. So that's with this whole funnel concept, what we're doing is we're narrowing down our opponent's range of possible hands to potentially one single hand. And it's typically not going to be one single hand, but it's going to be a very small subset of hands by the time we get to the river. So that's the whole goal and the idea of range-based thinking. And I'm going to be talking about this as we go throughout the course. And I just wanted to make sure that I talked about this now, because this is very important, and it's probably one of the hardest things that you can try to master. So I have lots of students that say, I'm having trouble putting my opponents on a range of hands. And so I typically, we can call this range-based thinking, but it really is hand reading our opponents and ranging our opponents, and learning to master to hand read our opponents and range our opponents really is the toughest thing, and it requires a lot of work off the table as well. So rather than just playing, it requires a lot of analysis off the table with different software and doing in-depth hand history reviews. And so you have to put a lot of time into doing this. And so when we do hand history reviews in this course, you'll actually see me doing this. All right, so a couple more slides. So in this slide, we're going to talk about bet sizing, and then we're going to finish up this lecture talking about thinking in big blinds. So bet sizing by pot size, also very important. So when I talk about bet sizing, I'm typically going to say we need to bet 2/3 of the pot, or we need to do it in big blinds. So it's either going to be bet sizing by pot size, or it's going to be thinking in big blinds. And there's a reason that we talk about both of these, and we're going to start off talking about pot size. So whether you're playing live, or you're playing in a card room, or you're playing at a friend's house, or you're playing online, it's a good habit to talk about your bet sizing, particularly post-flop, based on the size of the pot. So why is that? Well, it's universal. So what does that mean? What do I mean by universal? Well, whether I'm playing a $2 buying game or I'm playing a $500 buying game, a 1/3 pot size bet means the exact same thing in both of those games, when we're talking about the size of our bet that based on the size of the pot. So if there's 100 big blinds in the pot in a 2-0 game versus in a 5-0 game, that's the same thing as well. And if I'm betting 1/3 of that pot, it's the exact same thing. So rather than saying, oh, I bet 25 cents or I bet $250, that's not a universal way, and it's not a really easy way for people to think about specifically what you're doing. They have to do calculations sometimes if you don't include all the pot sizes and bets and everything else. But if you simply say, I bet 1/3 of the pot, or I bet a half of the pot, or I bet 3/4 of the pot, or I bet a full pot size bet, then they can say, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. Let's look at the math. Let's look at your opponent's range. Is that going to be an effective bet size based on the size of the pot? So you're going to hear me talk about this a lot, rather than saying I think you should bet 45 cents, or I think you should bet $2.25 instead of that. It's just this is a lot easier way for us to understand. And then when we look at poker mathematics, we look at these different bet sizes based on the size of the pot, and we can look at our pot odds, we can look at our break-even points if we're bluffing, and so forth. So it makes it a lot easier for multiple different perspectives and multiple different reasons. Okay, so that's betting by pot size. Let's go ahead and talk about the last thing we need to talk about in this video, this very lengthy video, and that is thinking in big blinds. So we talked about the position at the table, denoted uppercase BB. Well, when we're talking about our bet sizing and we're talking about our buy-in, we typically talk about that in terms of big blinds as well. And when we talk about our win rates, we also talk about it in big blinds as well. So typically I recommend that my students buy in for 100 big blinds, and that's fairly typical in most poker rooms online. So the maximum you can typically buy in is 100 big blinds. So if it is a 2 cent, 5 cents, where the big blind is 5 cents, you can buy in for $5. That would be 100 big blinds. And on the lower side, tables or poker rooms, they're going to make a minimum amount as well. Maybe 15 big blinds, it may be 20 big blinds, it may be 30 big blinds. It all depends on the poker room. But typically when I talk about bet sizing pre-flop, I'm going to be talking about it in regards to big blinds. And then if we do a hand history analysis, I like to talk about it in terms of big blinds as well, saying, your 3-bets should be this many big blinds and yada, 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 rather than again saying, let's say, for example, we're talking about 5-0, which would be 2 cents for the small blind and 5 cents for the big blind, rather than saying you should be open raising to 15 cents or 17 cents, you should be 3-betting to 52 cents. I'd rather say it in terms of big blinds. And again, the reason for this is that it's universal terminology, just like we talked about on the last slide, betting by pot size. So this is a universal terminology as well. And it doesn't matter what stake that you're playing, whether you're playing 2-0, 5 NL, 10 NL, 100 NL, 500 NL, 1000 NL, talking about BB, it means the same thing. So again, it's just something that I want you to understand and to know that I'm typically going to be talking about in terms of big blinds for your bet sizing as well, rather than talking about the monetary amount, whether it be 5 cents, 10 cents, $5, $100, or whatever. I prefer to talk about it in big blinds, and you'll notice that a lot of your peers, meaning fellow poker players in forums and study groups and so forth, they'll be doing the same thing as well. So we covered quite a lot in this video. We're at 25 minutes. If some of this stuff doesn't make sense, make sure you go back through and watch the video, print out the PowerPoint PDF presentation, and take that with you along as having some notes to look at as you're progressing through this course as well. And then, of course, if you ever have any questions, let me know. If not, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys at the next video. Take care.